Craftsman oilless air compressor. The specific model number is in the description. This particular air compressor was captured on its way to the garbage some time ago, and the general feeling is that, or was that, these compressors, as they're oilless, generally just destroy themselves eventually, and they just need to go away. I've rebuilt this one. I've rebuilt the wear elements of this one, and we'll explore that a little bit in this video. Not so specifically, but more generally, to just sort of see what the innards of these guys look like, and you can figure out whether a rebuild is going to work for you and your oilless air compressor. This is the working core of the air compressor. I've already taken it out. We'll explore getting to this point a little bit more as we move through the video. I threw a pause in here so that I can kind of tell you what I think failed on this particular compressor. If you look at the pulley towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a bolt capturing the crank arm onto it. Underneath that bolt is a bearing. That bearing failed. It worked the bolt out, and the piston kind of got thrown all over the place, destroyed the seal on the piston, and scored up the sleeve, which is towards the top of the screen a little bit. Those are replaceable. All of them are replaceable items. I bought a new bearing, had it pressed in. That was about 15 bucks. The piston seal, which came with the sleeve, and a new gasket for the head on this, which is not in this picture. All of that stuff cost me about 35 bucks. So I'm about 50 bucks down, basically rebuilding this compressor. So we'll bring the pause off and then we'll move forward. So I've loosened a lot of this stuff up so that it will be a little bit quicker to see what's going on. That bolt's coming out. Underneath that bolt is the bearing, which had failed. And obviously if that bearing fails, it's going to throw the piston all over the place. There's a head which goes on the top there and captures that sleeve. Once you take the head off, that whole thing slides out, and what I've got in my hand is pretty much most of the wear components in an oilless air, in this particular oilless air compressor. That sleeve and this seal, which is screwed in. It's almost like a washer in between two washers. Those were sold as like one part number, so I get the whole thing from Sears Parts Direct. Yes, this side out. So not very shocking is that at its very core, these things go back together pretty much the way that they came apart. Once you have a new sleeve and you have put a new seal in there, it goes into the sleeve a little bit tighter than I've shown here. You want to put Loctite on all of these fasteners. And once again here, that's locks onto the pulley. There's like a graphite gasket or a seal that sits on top of that sleeve, and then the head goes on top of that, and there's 4 bolts. Not really fantastically shocking, but whatever. So we'll look at this more in detail as we move along. This is the union between the air compressor and the tank. This is where the high pressure air fills the tank up. You're going to want to take this off so that you can separate the compressor unit from the tank, and then we'll visit removing it from the rails here in just another second, and we'll do more in reverse. There's a small bolt, a small screw actually, that holds this thing forward. You take that screw out, and then you're able to slide the body of the compressor rearward and free it from the tank. Obviously, if you've already taken the air line out like we just showed you, this will now separate. If you had taken the screws out from the plastic case, you would not be able to open it up because these rails are holding it together. So you slide it back and then you can open it up, and then we can move forward. So you strip the outer plastic off. There's 3 electrical connections. You can mark them and this whole thing separates. There's 4 bolts here. I've obviously loosened them up so that this will go forward a little bit quicker. That is the head, which comes off. Obviously the line is on it. This is the valve block, which you can look at and see if those are okay. There's a graphite gasket which sits on that valve block that may or may not make it. Maybe it needs to be replaced. That's a shot of this weird O-ring that is part of the gasket kit, which fits in the head there a little bit to seal that thing. There are no moving parts in that head. Yeah, so we've kind of seen this before. That's the bolt on the bearing, and you peel that thing off, which I've loosened that here as well, and that should come right out. Yeah, and then the whole thing just kind of slides out. That's the only thing that's capturing the sleeve in, is those 4 bolts on the cylinder head. Now I'm going to throw a pause in here just to show you that if you look to the right side of your screen, you'll see the bearing there. That's pressed into the crank arm. Sears Parts Direct, as marvelous as they are, does not sell that bearing separate from the crank arm. The crank arm with the bearing is like it would be like $52 with shipping. So I had the bearing pressed out, matched, and pressed back in. Cost me $15. Probably could have gotten that a lot cheaper had I, shopped elsewhere and pressed the bearing in and out myself. But that's what I did, is to just press a new bearing in rather than spend like 50-something bucks for a new piston. And the rest of the parts I bought from Sears Parts Direct here. Again, very helpful. They had a lot of really marvelous exploded diagrams to look and pick through and figure out what I wanted. So at this point we'll just sort of move along. Alright, so I've thrown another pause in here. This is the business end of the piston. You can see that in the center there's a Torx head screw. That has to come out, and then immediately surrounding that is a metal, essentially like a washer of sorts, that locks in the seal, which you're seeing in the center, which is that black ring, which is around the periphery of that. That's like some kind of graphite impregnated fibrous thing. That just gets replaced. You put the metal washer back on it, and the screw goes back in. Everything centers up nicely. I'm putting Loctite on everything. They suggest torque wrench settings in inch-pounds for a lot of stuff. I don't have an inch wrench, so I just kind of clamped it down, but you can use your own discretion in that department. Alright, so this is the reassembly. I've speeded this up because actually we've seen a lot of this stuff before. Obviously this side out needs to be out. I'm watching this in kind of a jumpy form, so I'm not entirely sure what you're seeing. What I do spend a lot of time on in this clip is seating 2 bolts in the head, making sure that the head is centered properly in a way that I'm happy with, and then putting 2 bolts with Loctite on them, and then taking the first 2 bolts out, putting Loctite on them, putting them back in, and then clamping them down. Again, I don't have a torque wrench on this. Maybe I should. It worked out okay and it's fine. One thing that you're not seeing in this clip is me putting Loctite on and clamping down on the bolt for the crankshaft. What I did was I just jammed a chunk of metal in the pulley so that I could get some good torque on it, and that seemed to work out okay. So here we are putting the body of the compressor back into the plastic housing. You see those little plastic pucks? Those fit on little squares on the outside of the actual compressor, and that's how it fits into the plastic shell. There's little recesses in the shell that are specifically for seating those. I guess they're shock absorbing something or other, and you just kind of weave those in and try to remember how it came apart, which is always exciting. Yeah, putting this thing back together again, it was kind of surprising how much monkey wrenching I needed to do on it. So there's your 3 connectors. Obviously we've put them on. Try to weave this plug back in there so that I can get the other side of the plastic on. You know, I pretty much stripped all of the screws out on this plastic shell, and I'll be addressing that in just a second. But ultimately, yeah, that's what happens, is you just try to get it slammed together and then put it back on the rails, and it'll slide on pretty much the same way that we got it off. So as I suggested earlier, all the screws were pretty much stripped out of this thing. I've got a clamp on the top of it to keep it together. You'll see that's a zip tie, and rather than mess around with trying to restore some threads and plastic and whatever, I decided to just throw it together with a goofy repair. This is a long zip tie, 2 long zip ties, and I've clipped off the, I guess we'll call it the clamp end on one, and I'm using that like a nut. And what's going to happen is I'll separate that, and then I'll weave the other zip tie through the stripped out hole, which is in the plastic, and then just push my my new plastic nut on the end of it, which, yeah, there we go. And that needs to be set. So there's the hammer and the screwdriver. That's a Phillips screwdriver, I believe. So I'll push that nut all the way in, and then pull on the zip tie and hit it with a hammer a couple of times to seat it, and that's fine, and it's been fine. Ultimately, if at this point this repair hadn't worked out, and if I needed to get it open again, it'd be easy to just break those ties off. We are back at the beginning. The air pressure line has been sealed back into the tank with Teflon tape, and the compressor's been put back on the rails on top of the air tank and slid forward. It's at this point that you put these screws back into that little spot right in the corner there to lock it onto the air tank. And maybe at this point you're ready to start it up and check it work. So it sounds pretty good. In retrospect, if the bearing failure would have been particularly noisy and the previous owner should have caught that and maybe addressed it sooner than later, wouldn't have been totally destroyed and ended up going to the garbage to ultimately be fixed up by me at a slightly greater cost. So the compressor cuts out at the right pressure, which we'll show here. It's 150. It gets up there, in a time that I guess is reasonable. And all in all, a great victory. Here again, this video not too specific, but I hope it maybe helped you out generally.